Hello, everyone. I'm the director for our New Zealand registered not-for-profit educational charitable trust. We've been around since the 90s, and I brought all of the skills that I and hundreds of families developed in the early 1970s into New Zealand and put it into a charitable trust because it was so important. What was happening in the early 1970s was at a pathway between two potential ways that we would look at birth. One got chosen, this one didn't. And now, 40 years later, we're going back and saying we need to heal the problems that have existed in childbirth. And what exactly are the problems? And this is what this series is going to dedicate itself to. So I've written down as many things as I know and have researched about you and childbirth or I and childbirth. For instance, one of my children was 8 weeks premature. That made a difference. I went into a strange hospital. That made a difference. So what is this talk about today? This is the first in the series, so you can follow us on YouTube. It's about you, your childbirth, and what does this term natural and normal or physiological birth really mean? Not only what does it mean, has it always meant that? So the reality is in 1970, when I gave birth, 95% of women labored and had a vaginal birth because cesareans were such serious abdominal surgery done to save a woman's life, really. So everybody labored and gave birth vaginally. That included all of us that were low risk and normal, and all of us that were high risk. That we were high risk, our baby was high risk. So when we labored with or without risks because the medical profession in the 70s wasn't as sophisticated as it was now. So we all theoretically had normal and natural and physiological births. We did that within the context in the United States of all the assessments, monitoring, and procedures. So how did we fare? How did women of my generation or from the 60s to the mid-70s fare? Well, some of us just sort of spit our kids out, not a problem. Others just labored for days. Many of us suffered in childbirth. Many of us found that it was quite easy, sort of a nothing burger. Others of us who had risks, the risks never eventuated as problems. Some of us, the problems did eventuate, but it didn't mean that we died or our baby died. Some of us had tragic births. So when people talk about normal and natural physiological birth, there is the reality of that phrase, which is that anything that might happen can happen. But there's good news in that. There is no general risk in childbirth, really. It's specific risks. I didn't have twins. I had a premature baby, right? If you have a breech baby, that's a potential risk. If you have Rh negative, that's a potential risk. If you have Rh negative and you have a heart problem and you have a breech baby and you have triplets, those are compounded risks. So you need to understand that the words normal mean it can happen. It doesn't mean it's frequent. It can happen. Natural means that it occurs. It can occur in nature. And physiological is that you just let that process unfold. Whether it's a good birth, long birth, short birth, risks, no risks, problems, no problems, tragedy, no tragedy. And what happened in the early 1980s is that those words got co-opted and the meaning of them got shifted. So when women today say, I want a normal and natural birth or physiological birth or whatever phrases are being used nowadays, the implication is that one is they're easy, that they're safe, that they have a good outcome, that often they're enjoyable, and that nothing happens. It's all okay. And that is common. That That has always been common. That's how these words got co-opted. And by co-opting these words, because if you're listening to this now and you're pregnant and you're thinking, I want a natural and normal physiological birth, then you need to understand what is your context for that. So if you think that choosing a natural birth, that you will have an easy birth, you might not. You may choose a natural birth, and it may go on for days. You may want a normal birth, and that normal birth includes you tearing through your rectum and having pain on intimacy for the rest of your life. That's normal. You may want a physiological birth where people have hands off and they don't attend to something, and that physiological birth includes a very long cord and the baby's wrapped up in the cord and the baby ends up in a NICU unit, whether the baby has problems or not. So these three words relative to you need to make sense. And they don't make sense. And that's what we're going to try to do in this series, is talk about individual things and try to make sense of them. So in the description, we actually ask questions. Have you had a normal and natural birth? What was it? What did that mean? So for instance, in New Zealand, under the midwifery-led maternity system, there was a midwife who researched hundreds of notes by midwives and came to the conclusion in the early 2000s that the word normal and natural birth meant anything other than a cesarean, and that included every single type of intervention. So is that what we mean? Is that what you mean? So would other people recognize your birth as normal and natural? These are the questions we need to ask. And what are the criteria? What is the criteria that we're using for normal and natural births? If our criteria is that women don't have interventions, then you need to understand that, and I'm going to put a list up of interventions here, is that, there you go, good me, technical, is that there are 30 things that we as women are saying to one another that we have to avoid in order to have a normal and natural birth. Does that make sense to us as women, to each other? Does it make sense to you? Does it make sense to how we're talking about birth? So from our viewpoint as Birthing Better Families and as a charitable trust, no, it doesn't make sense. And this is what we want you to understand. What is really normal and natural about childbirth? 100% of pregnant women will end their pregnancy normally and naturally, but not necessarily physiologically, by giving birth. In other words, pregnancy normally and naturally comes to the end and we birth. 100% of us birth one way or another, without a doubt. That's what normal and natural means. It means your pregnancy is going to end and you are going to give birth. A cesarean is not a physiological process. However, your pregnancy is normally and naturally ending in the birth that you have. And Birthing Better Families, when we developed the skills in the early 70s, we made a very, very clear demarcation of who we represented. And we represented the 100% of pregnant women. Because it was just starting, the conversation was just starting to build momentum that a normal and natural birth was differentiated from one that had medical interventions, much less a cesarean. So that was the beginning part of the divide. It had started a little bit in the 50s and the 60s when the first childbirth preparation classes were taught. Those were Lamaze, the Bradley method, Grantley, Dick Reed, Childbirth Without Fear. Those three obstetricians were very clear in articulating that the medical profession was standardizing medical assessments, monitoring, and procedures, now called interventions, for all pregnant women, and that they wanted to differentiate between high-risk women and low-risk women. And from our viewpoint as families that became skilled, is that that was one of the primal mistakes in the conversation around childbirth, and that's why this series is so important. 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth. You are going to give birth one way or another. No matter where you birth, no matter who's present at your birth, no matter your beliefs around childbirth, no matter the circumstances around your pregnancy or your family, no matter whether you have choices or lack choices or whether your choices change, and no matter what happens to you around you. Because another normal and natural aspect of childbirth, which we cannot avoid, is there's no way to know what your birth is going to be like. And babies don't come to plan. So when you're thinking about your birth, if you're thinking very narrowly that the word normal, natural, or physiological means a certain thing to you, then how are you going to achieve that? How would other people recognize your birth as normal and natural? And if you believe that you, like the midwife who looked at statistics and said all the births other than the cesarean was considered normal and natural, at least that was generous. That meant women who had all 30 interventions but didn't have a cesarean could still say they had a normal and natural birth. That's a lot more forgiving than if you read the ideal birth list in this post and realize that people who are talking about normal and natural physiological birth now do not want any birth to have any intervention, right? And that's just too hard. We as women are building these walls around our own births and around each other's births. So we need to then ask, what isn't a normal and natural birth? Well, we know a cesarean isn't natural. It's a surgery. However, should we devalue our birth, our baby's birth, if we have a cesarean? And the answer since the 1980s and 90s has been yes, we should. That we should somehow view labor and a vaginal birth as an elevated form of birth, what women normally and naturally do at the end of pregnancies. And those that have a cesarean, unless they could almost prove that there was a risk that could damage themselves or their babies, that cesarean births weren't really giving birth. That's women. This is women talking to each other. I've been in this field for 50 years globally. I have heard tens and thousands of birth stories. I know the conversation, and it's mean. And that's what we have to stop. And that's one reason our trust is doing this series, because you are going to give birth. And this is what is normal and natural. You got pregnant to have a baby. You did not get pregnant to have a type of birth. You got pregnant to have a baby. And you will give birth. And it's an activity that you have to do. Yes, it's an event, a big one. Yes, it's something that happens to you. Yes, it's something that you have very little control over, even if you have choices. However, you have to do it. You either have to do it by laboring and having a vaginal birth, whether that takes 3 hours or 72 hours. You have to do it. If you're driving to the hospital, you're being prepped, you're lying on a table, and you're having your belly cut open and stitched up. You have to do this activity. And why is it so important that we perceive of birth as an activity that each of us does? Because that's an action word. When we say, I gave birth, I'm giving birth, what does that mean? But if we say we're doing the activity of birthing our baby, it's an action. We've taken action. So what actions do we have? And very little. Because back then, when I gave birth in the 1970s, and back then, when the first childbirth preparation classes were taught by doctors who began to split low risk, normal from high risk, what's that, abnormal? No, it's still normal. But they began to split this conversation, and that's the primal mistake, because 100% of pregnant women are going to have to do the activity of birthing their baby. So when that got split, these three obstetricians, Lamaze, Bradley, and Grantley Dick Reed, developed skills so that women having low-risk births, if they use those skills, could achieve three narrow goals. Natural birth, pain-free labor with no medical interventions. Those are narrow goals. And what's a broader goal? A broader goal is that women don't suffer, that they feel in control, that they cope, that they manage, that they work through, that they deal with, that they stay on top of this activity that each of us does at the end of our pregnancy. Skills are important. We had skills for a short period of time, at least in the United States. But then the next generation that became a global voice of childbirth was the natural birth movement and the home birth midwifery movement. And they dismissed skills because not enough women had achieved those narrow goals. They didn't look at the bigger issue, which was that women had suffered in childbirth, which didn't mean that there was a problem. It meant that the normal and natural and physiological pain of labor contractions overwhelmed women when they lacked skills. So it's really important for you to understand that we have taken three simple words and we've twisted their meaning to mean something else. And as women, fewer and fewer women are achieving that twisted meaning and that very narrow definition. So we have more questions. Should women feel prouder of themselves for having a labor and a vaginal birth than somebody who doesn't? Should they feel prouder of themselves if they didn't have any of those 30 interventions, or that they had that ideal birth, than a woman who didn't? And that's where the shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, frustration, anger, and birth trauma has just fumed since I gave birth in 1970, when in the United States, multiple millions of us used very weak, but at least some level of skills in Lamaze and Bradley. Some of us excelled with using those skills, but for many people, those skills didn't work as effectively as we would like skills to work, because one is they were targeted only to some women, and two is they weren't adjustable and adaptable and sustainable. And so birthing better families developed skills that were. It was as simple as that. So if we don't speak about birth as normal and natural, then how do we talk about it? What do we call it? Is there a birth that's abnormal or abnatural or non-natural? We know that a cesarean is not physiological, but we're coming to the end of our pregnancy, and pregnancy naturally and normally ends with a birth. That's what it does for 100% of pregnant women. And then we have to do the activity of doing the birth. So is there anything that you can do to achieve a normal and natural birth? One is define it for yourself. And then ask yourself this question: are you defining something for yourself that you may not achieve? And then how are you going to feel about it? So this is what we want to tell you as I wrap up this first of the series, is use skills. This is what our trust says, and we're going to repeat it at every single one of these series. Everything comes from an idea and words and actions that follow. So the idea that our trust has put forward since the 70s, which has not yet been adopted, and we hope it will be, is that it's normal and natural when you're pregnant to self-learn birth and birth coaching skills. Then use those skills to work through the activity of birthing your baby. Simple as that. Now, how do you do that? Well, now we're lucky. You can go online. We have online birthing classes, but there are other skills-based methods. But don't confuse skills-based methods with information. How dilated you are, the position your baby in, has nothing to do with whether you can breathe and relax and open up and prepare your body. Skills are what you do what you use to do the activity. Then write a skills-based birth plan. Tell your birth professional from 24 weeks onward what skills you're learning. They don't have to know what they are. Just have them write them in the notes. I learned breathing at 24 weeks. I learned relaxation at 28 weeks. I learned hypnobirthing at 32 weeks. Or I learned directed breathing or touch relaxation. Have them write it in your notes, even just 1 or 2 words. Because as your birth unfolds, as pregnancy naturally and normally comes to an end, as you do the activity of birthing your baby, no matter where you birth, who's present, yada, 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 then if you look like you're coping and managing well and not suffering, have your birth professional praise you and your partner. If you look overwhelmed and stressed, they can refer to your notes and say, well, you said you learned breathing at 24 weeks. I said I did, but I didn't. Well, that's okay. You got to deal with that, don't you? Right? But if you did, just remember, you got pregnant to have a baby, and you're doing the activity of birthing your baby right now. That's the activity you're doing right now. So use your skills right now to birth your baby. So what we want to do throughout these series is to give you one of the Birthing Better skills that mothers and fathers developed. They asked me to carry them forward. Was I instrumental in developing the skills with them? Sure, I was the center of the spokes of hundreds and hundreds of people. I kept it all in my brain until we could create resources. But one of the things that mothers and fathers learned, because we are all one humanity, we all blink, we all cough, we can all tighten up our rectum, we all breathe. So one of the skills we learned is that we had to understand the 4 ways that all humans breathe. Most of us don't know. Well, let's put it this way. Yeah, we know. We just can't articulate it. But as soon as I say it, you go, yeah, I know, but you couldn't articulate it. So what are the 4 ways that humans breathe? Ask yourself that question. I've asked it in hundreds of classes, and there's just dead silence. Some people will say fast or slow. Yep, that's true. Yep, some people will say in the chest and in my belly. Yep, that's true. Some people will say in my nose and out my mouth, closer. So the way all humans breathe is in our nose, out our nose, in our nose, out our mouth, in our mouth, out our mouth, in our mouth and out our nose. That's how we breathe. Those are the only 4 ways. Nobody breathes in their ears. Nobody breathes in their eyes, at the top of their head. So when you know that, you go, I know that. So then we had to discover this ourselves, because we sort of, like you, didn't know it. Now we do know it. But then we had to ask the question, if we're breathing in our nose and out our mouth, when are we doing that in life? To which most of us go, what are you talking about? Some people say, well, I do it when I want to relax. Yep, got that. Other people who use the Bradley method, which was in the nose and out the mouth, said, I screamed. Ah! You can do that. Often men will say, when I'm doing physical activity, yep, do that. How about sex? Do that too. How about really focused relaxation? Yep, we do that as well. So in the nose, out the mouth has all these variations. Which one would you choose to indicate that you were in control rather than stressed or freaked out? For us, it's not hard to answer. All human beings know it. This is stressed out. This is stressed out. This is focused. Or, so your homework for today is to go through those other breathing patterns, in the nose, out the nose. Find out how you use that and how that varies. In the nose, out the mouth. Go through that again. Find what will keep you in control. In the nose, in the mouth, out the nose. When do you use that? In and out the mouth. When do you use that? We have to know in order to know what to do. And that's what Birthing Better families did. We deconstructed everything so that we could explain it So the idea was that it's normal and natural to learn birth skills, and we had to have words for that. And breathing was one of those areas of skills that we needed good words for. Because when Bradley said to people, breathe in your nose and out your mouth, it ranged from to ah to ah. And you know what men interpreted that? They just said, oh, she's breathing in her nose and out her mouth. And women were going, how can't you help me? How can't you see that I've lost control? So we need to have the skills for ourselves, not for someone else, just for ourselves. So breathing in your nose and out your mouth in a relaxed manner may not take the natural occurring pain away. It is a choice to cope better with that pain. So we're going to go through a long list in this series. Find us on YouTube. It will be called You and Childbirth Series. And I'm going to do a live eCam every day until I have talked it all out to you. So please follow us and subscribe on YouTube. Please tell other people about this, because you will be found in many of these issues. Many of these issues you will be found. This is you and your baby's birth. You want a safe birth, and you want to have a positive birth. The best way to achieve a positive birth is to become skilled and use your skills to work through the activity of birthing your baby. No matter where you birth, no matter who is present, no matter your circumstances, no matter your beliefs, no matter your choices or your lack of choices, or your change of choices, or no matter what happens to or around you. This is your baby's birth. Use skills to birth your baby. It makes common sense, and that's why our trust is called common knowledge.